He's definitely going to eat me, Dax muttered, clutching his emergency flare like it was a weapon. Wait, she? What the? He froze. The alien was stunning. Not in a runaway, screaming kind of way, but in the kind of way that made his stomach do weird flips, which was inconvenient because this was precisely the kind of situation where running away screaming was the recommended strategy. She stood at the edge of the clearing, bathed in the eerie blue light of the alien moon. Her skin shimmered faintly, as though the galaxy itself had woven her into existence. Well, he whispered to no one, if she's going to kill me, at least I'll die looking at something pretty. She tilted her head, her large iridescent eyes narrowing slightly. I can hear you, you know. Dax yelped and stumbled back a step. Oh, hi? He stammered, holding the flare out like a sword. Come in peace. Please don't, eat me. Her lips curved into a smile, a slow, almost predatory one that made him question his life choices more thoroughly than usual. Eat you? That's presumptuous. Yeah, I know, he blurted, his voice cracking. Sorry, forget I said that. Not that you couldn't eat me because you totally could. You're clearly capable. Just, maybe don't. She took a step closer, her movements so smooth they made gravity seem like a suggestion. Dax tried not to panic, which was going great, except for all the panicking. You're strange, she said, her voice low and melodic, and loud. What species are you? I'm human, he replied, lowering the flare slightly. From Earth. Maybe you've heard of it. Small blue planet, big on coffee and bad decisions. Earth, she repeated, as though tasting the word. I've heard of it. Primitive, chaotic, full of... She paused, her glowing eyes scanning him up and down with an unsettling intensity. Peculiar creatures. Dax swallowed hard. Well, you're not wrong. We're a work in progress. She stepped closer again, now only a few feet away. Up close, her features were even more mesmerizing. Her metallic skin seemed to ripple faintly with every movement, and her hair, or what he thought was hair, floated gently as if underwater. She smelled faintly of ozone and something sweet he couldn't quite place. What are you doing here, human? She asked, her voice softer now but no less commanding. Dax shrugged, trying to seem casual despite the sweat dripping down his neck. Oh, you know, just a classic story. Guy takes a job delivering cargo, crash lands on an uncharted planet, meets a highly intimidating alien woman who might or might not eat him. Same old. Same old. Her smile widened, and for a terrifying moment, he thought she was about to sprout fangs or something equally horrifying. Instead, she laughed, a rich, unexpected sound that made his heart skip a beat for reasons he wasn't entirely comfortable with. You amuse me, human, she said, her gaze softening slightly. Great, Dax said, his voice a touch too enthusiastic. Amused is good. Amused is much better than murderous. She reached out suddenly, her hand moving so fast he barely had time to flinch. Her fingers brushed his face, tracing a faint scratch on his cheek from the crash. Her touch was cool and electric, sending a shiver down his spine. Relax, she said, her tone somewhere between teasing and commanding. If I wanted to kill you, you'd already be dead. Comforting, he muttered, though his legs felt like jelly. She stepped back, her gaze flickering briefly to the smoldering wreckage of his ship in the distance. You're stranded, she said simply. Yeah, Dax admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. Unless you happen to have a spare interstellar engine lying around, I'm pretty much stuck here. Her eyes glinted with something he couldn't quite read. Perhaps we can help each other, human. Dax blinked. We? Wait, there's more of you? Her smile turned enigmatic. That depends. Are you always this entertaining? He groaned inwardly. Oh, great. I'm the punchline of an alien sitcom. She chuckled again, the sound somehow both disarming and unnerving. Follow me, she said, turning gracefully and gliding back toward the shadows of the forest. Yeah, sure, let me just follow the potentially dangerous alien deeper into her territory, Dax muttered, rolling his eyes as he started after her. What could possibly go wrong? From behind her, she shot him a look over her shoulder, her smile widening ever so slightly. Careful, human. I might just surprise you. Dax wasn't sure if that was a promise or a threat. Either way, he was starting to think he might actually enjoy finding out. The forest hummed with life, or something close to it. Pulsating vines curled along massive tree trunks that stretched impossibly high, their bark shimmering with an iridescent glow. Strange sounds echoed in the distance, chirps, clicks, and the occasional deep rumble that made Dax's hair stand on end. He tried to focus on his guide, her fluid movements cutting through the alien terrain like she'd been born from it. So, he began, stepping over a gnarled root that looked suspiciously like it was breathing. Do I get to know your name, or should I just keep calling you tall, shiny, and terrifying? She didn't stop or even look back. My kind doesn't use names the way you do. Right. Of course not, Dax muttered, sidestepping a cluster of what looked like glowing mushrooms but smelled like wet socks. Why would anything here be simple? She finally turned her head slightly, a flicker of amusement in her luminous eyes. You may call me Zara, if it helps your fragile human mind. Zara, Dax repeated, testing the name. All right, cool. Zara it is. And just so we're clear, you're not leading me to some kind of sacrificial pit, right? Because I'm not great with pits, or sacrifices. Zara stopped abruptly, turning to face him. Sacrifice? She repeated, her tone laced with mock offense. How primitive do you think I am? Very much hoping not at all, Dax said, flashing her his most disarming smile. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment before she turned and resumed walking. Relax, human. If I wanted to kill you, I wouldn't bother with theatrics. Right, because you do it fast, Dax muttered under his breath, jogging to keep up. The path grew narrower, the trees closing in around them like a living cathedral. Bioluminescent plants cast a soft, otherworldly glow, and Dax couldn't help but marvel at the sheer beauty of it. Okay, I'll admit, he said, breaking the silence. This place is kind of incredible. Terrifying, sure, but also stunning. Like you, not you specifically. You're also stunning, but... Zara stopped again, raising one elegant brow. Are all humans this bad at forming coherent sentences? Dax winced. Only the really unlucky ones. Or maybe just me. Hard to say. She made a sound that might have been a laugh, though it was hard to tell. You're strange, she said again, this time with a faint trace of warmth. Yeah, well, you're not exactly normal either, Dax shot back, his confidence bolstered by her reaction. Not that I'm complaining. If I had to be stranded on an alien planet, I guess I could have done worse than landing near someone who... glows. Zara tilted her head, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite place. You're bold for someone so fragile, she said finally. Bold? He asked, grinning. I think the word you're looking for is charmingly reckless. Zara turned away again, but not before he caught the faintest hint of a smile. They continued in silence for a while, the forest growing denser and more alive with every step. Dax's nerves were on edge, his senses hyper-aware of every rustle and shadow. But there was something about Zara, her confidence, her unflinching calm, that made him feel safer than he probably should have. So, he ventured after a while, where exactly are we going? To my ship, she replied simply. Your ship? You mean the one that looked like it exploded when I crashed? It's not as broken as it seems, she said, her tone carrying a hint of pride. Dax raised an eyebrow. You're telling me you can fix a ship that got turned into interstellar confetti? She glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. Can't you? Touché, Dax muttered. They emerged into a clearing and Dax's jaw dropped. In the center stood what remained of Zara's vessel, At first glance, it did look like a pile of debris, but as he got closer, he realized the ship was healing itself. Fragments of metal shifted and reconnected with an eerie organic fluidity, like pieces of a living puzzle. Okay, that's freaky, he admitted, watching as a jagged panel slid back into place with a soft hum. Freaky? Zara repeated, raising a brow. In the best way, he added quickly. Seriously, though, your ship is basically alive? In a way, she said, running a hand over the vessel's shimmering surface. It's built to adapt and repair itself, much like me. Dax blinked. Wait, you can do that? Her smile turned playful. Curious, aren't you? Let's just say I'm cautiously impressed, he said, leaning against a nearby tree. So how long before this thing's spaceworthy again? A few hours, perhaps less, she said, stepping back to examine the ship. Hours? Dax whistled. Man, human engineers would kill for that kind of tech. We can barely fix a vending machine without calling someone in. Zara's lips twitched, and Dax felt a small surge of triumph. Making her smile was quickly becoming his new favorite sport. And what will you do once it's fixed? She asked suddenly, her tone quieter. The question caught him off guard. I guess, head back to my ship? Try to salvage it, maybe call for help? He hesitated. I mean, assuming I survive long enough to make it to the colony. Zara studied him for a moment, her gaze softer than before. Perhaps, she said slowly, you don't have to leave so quickly. Dax blinked. Wait, are you saying you want me to stick around? Her expression remained enigmatic, but her eyes gleamed with a mischievous light. Let's just say, I'm not finished with you yet. Dax's heart did a funny little flip. Well, when you put it like that, how could I possibly say no? Good, she said, her smile widening just enough to make him wonder if he should be flattered or terrified. Maybe both. Dax sat cross-legged on the mossy ground, watching Zara work on her ship, or rather, watching the ship work on itself under her supervision. Panels slid into place, cracks sealed with a faint hiss, and the entire vessel seemed to pulse faintly, like it was alive. So, is this like a you talk, it listens situation? He asked, gesturing vaguely at the ship. Something like that, Zara replied without looking up, her hands brushing over a series of glowing symbols etched into the hull. Our technology is symbiotic. It responds to thought, intention. Symbiotic, Dax repeated, nodding sagely. Cool, cool. Totally normal. Meanwhile, I have to smack my coffee machine twice to get it to stop spitting steam at me. Zara arched an eyebrow at him. Your primitive tools are charming. Charming? He echoed, offended. I'll have you know humanity has made incredible technological advancements. We've got smartphones, electric cars, pizza delivery drones. Pizza? Zara interrupted, tilting her head. Oh, you'd love pizza, Dax said, grinning. It's this perfect combination of bread, sauce, and cheese, sometimes with toppings, sometimes not. It's a unifier, a cultural cornerstone. Fascinating, Zara said, though her expression suggested she found it anything but. Dax leaned back against a tree, folding his arms. All right, Miss Advanced Alien. If pizza doesn't impress you, what does? Come on, give me something. She paused, her gaze thoughtful. I find your resilience intriguing. Dax blinked. My what now? Your ability to adapt despite your fragility, she said, gesturing at him vaguely. Your species is physically weak, lacking in natural defenses, yet you thrive in hostile environments. You survive through ingenuity. That is impressive. Dax opened his mouth, then closed it again. Wow, I think that's the nicest backhanded compliment I've ever gotten. Zara tilted her head, clearly unbothered. It's an observation, not a compliment. Uh-huh, Dax said, smirking. And calling me intriguing wasn't flirting, right? Flirting? Zara repeated, a faint flicker of amusement crossing her face. Is that what you think this is? Dax held up his hands defensively. Hey, I'm just saying, you've been very focused on me since we met. Like, very focused. Feels a little personal. Zara stepped closer, her glowing eyes locked onto his. Perhaps it is personal, she said softly, her voice carrying an edge of teasing. Dax's smirk faltered, his throat suddenly dry. Okay, cool. That's cool. Her smile widened ever so slightly, and she turned back to her ship without another word, leaving him to stew in his own awkwardness. The minutes stretched on, the hum of the ship's repairs filling the silence. Dax fidgeted, picking at a piece of moss on the ground. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. So, what happens after this? He blurted out. Zara didn't look up. After what? After the ship's fixed, he said. Do you just fly off and leave me here? Or are you planning to, keep me around as some kind of pet? She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Would you prefer to stay? Dax blinked. I mean, not prefer exactly. I've got people waiting for me back home, probably. A life, bills to pay, terrible reality shows to binge, but he hesitated. I guess I wouldn't mind, helping you, if you needed it. Helping me? Zara repeated, her tone skeptical. Yeah, Dax said quickly, warming to the idea. I mean, you're clearly capable, but everyone needs a sidekick, right? Someone to crack jokes and carry the heavy stuff. I'm great at carrying heavy stuff. Zara regarded him for a long moment, her gaze almost thoughtful. You're not what I expected, human, she said finally. Thanks, Dax said, unsure if that was a compliment. She shook her head, her metallic hair catching the light. I'm not sure yet whether that's a good thing. Before Dax could respond, a low rumble echoed through the forest, shaking the ground beneath them. He shot to his feet, his heart racing. Please tell me that's just the ship doing a system check, he said nervously. Zara's eyes narrowed, her entire demeanor shifting. Stay here, she said, her tone sharp. Stay here? Are you kidding me? Dax protested, scrambling after her as she strode toward the edge of the clearing. What if that's like a giant alien bear or something? You can't just… Quiet, she snapped, holding up a hand. Dax shut his mouth, but his brain kept running in panicked circles. The rumble came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of snapping branches. Whatever was coming, it was big. Zara's posture was tense, her glowing eyes scanning the tree line. Without looking at him, she said, If you value your life, stay behind me. Dax hesitated, then nodded, pressing his back against the ship. Cool. Staying behind the scary alien lady. Love this plan. Zara didn't respond, her attention locked on the approaching noise. The ground trembled as the sounds grew closer, and Dax's mind raced with increasingly ridiculous scenarios. Was it a predator? Another alien? A really angry tree? When the creature finally emerged from the shadows, Dax's jaw dropped. It was massive, easily twice the size of an elephant, with scales that glimmered like molten gold and 6 legs that moved with unnerving precision. Its eyes glowed faintly, fixed on Zara with unsettling intelligence. Okay, Dax whispered, clutching the ship for dear life. That's definitely not a bear. Zara stepped forward, her posture calm but commanding. The creature rumbled again, a low resonant sound that made Dax's teeth vibrate. What's it doing? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Testing me, Zara replied. Dax blinked. Testing you? For what? She glanced back at him, her expression fierce. For weakness. Oh, great, Dax muttered, sinking lower against the ship. Good luck with that. I'll just be here, practicing my not dying face. The golden-scaled creature rumbled again, its 6 legs shifting the earth beneath it as it loomed over Zara. Its eyes glowed brighter, the intensity sending chills down Dax's spine. Every survival instinct in his body screamed for him to run, but he was rooted to the spot, both terrified and oddly fascinated. Zara remained perfectly still, her posture impossibly calm. She tilted her head slightly, meeting the creature's gaze with an intensity that felt almost conversational. "Okay," Dax muttered under his breath. "Not a bear. Definitely not a bear. Maybe a dragon, space dragon, alien gold-plated murder lizard?" The creature let out a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a roar, the force of it rippling through the air. Dax flinched, clinging to the ship like it was a lifeboat. "Zara?" he called out, his voice high-pitched. "Anytime you want to explain what's going on, that'd be great." "Be silent, Dax," Zara said sharply, her voice carrying a weight that made him shut up instantly. The creature lowered its massive head, bringing it level with Zara. For a moment, they stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then, to Dax's utter disbelief, Zara raised a hand and placed it gently against the creature's shimmering scales. It froze, its glowing eyes narrowing slightly. "What is she doing?" Dax whispered, his heart hammering. The creature made a deep, resonant noise, almost like a purr, and leaned into Zara's touch. She murmured something in a language Dax didn't recognize, her voice low and melodic. The creature's eyes softened, the glow dimming slightly, and it pulled back, its massive body shifting with an almost lazy grace. Zara turned to Dax, her expression unreadable. "You can come out now." "Come out?" Dax repeated, his voice cracking. "From this perfectly safe spot? Are you sure it's not going to eat me?" She tilted her head, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "It won't eat you." "Yeah, forgive me if I'm not convinced," Dax said, slowly inching out from behind the ship. The creature's gaze shifted to him, and Dax froze mid-step. Its eyes glimmered with something he could only describe as curiosity. Zara gestured for him to come closer. "It's harmless now." "Harmless," Dax hissed. "It's the size of a freaking house." "Do you always complain this much?" she asked, arching a brow. "Only when I'm about to get eaten," Dax shot back, but he forced his feet to move. Step by step, he inched closer until he was standing beside Zara, painfully aware of the creature's every breath. The creature sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring, and leaned down toward Dax. He yelped, stumbling back as its massive head came within inches of him. "Relax," Zara said, a hint of exasperation in her voice. "It's merely curious." "Curious about how I taste, probably," Dax muttered, but he stayed put. The creature let out a soft huff, its breath warm and strangely floral, and nudged him gently with its snout. Dax flailed, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "Oh, sure, just nuzzle the fragile human. Totally fine, no pressure." Zara smirked, her eyes glinting. "It likes you." "Well, that makes one of us," Dax said, though he couldn't help the nervous chuckle that escaped him. The creature straightened, its massive body shifting as it turned and lumbered back into the forest. The ground trembled with each step, and within moments it disappeared into the trees. Dax exhaled shakily, collapsing against the ship. "Okay, that was something. Are all your alien neighbors this friendly?" Zara glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "That was a sentinel. It protects this region, ensuring balance is maintained." "Balance," Dax repeated. "Right. Totally normal. Just another day in the life of the interstellar wilderness." She tilted her head, studying him. "You handled yourself better than I expected." "Better than you expected?" Dax laughed incredulously. "I didn't even pee myself. I deserve a medal." Zara's lips curved into a faint smile. "Perhaps I underestimated you." "Perhaps," Dax said, grinning despite himself. "Come on, admit it. I'm tougher than I look." She didn't reply immediately, her gaze lingering on him. For a moment, the tension shifted, something unspoken passing between them. "You surprise me, human," she said softly, turning back to her ship. Dax blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in her tone. "Is that a good thing?" Zara didn't answer, but the faintest smile played at her lips as she resumed her work. "Great," Dax muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. "Just keep me guessing, why don't you?" But even as he grumbled, he couldn't ignore the warmth spreading through his chest. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, he found himself smiling too. The evening came softly, the alien forest bathed in hues of violet and gold. Dax sat on a fallen log near the ship, watching Zara work. Or rather, pretending to watch Zara work. In reality, his attention kept drifting, to the way her metallic hair caught the light, to the way her glowing eyes narrowed in focus, to the subtle curve of her lips when she thought she was alone. "You're staring again," Zara said without looking up. Dax blinked, caught red-handed. "What? No, I was, just admiring the tree over there." Zara glanced at the tree in question, a warped, luminous thing with pulsing roots. "It's a feeding vine," she said. "It would dissolve you in seconds." Dax scooted an inch farther away from the vine. "Good to know. Thanks for the heads up." Zara chuckled softly, and Dax's heart did a little flip. "So," he said, trying to sound casual, "how's the ship coming along?" "Almost ready to take off and leave me behind forever." She paused, her fingers hovering over a glowing panel on the hull. "You assume I'll leave you?" "Well, yeah," Dax said, frowning. "Why wouldn't you? You've got places to go, people, or I guess aliens to see. Meanwhile, I'm just some guy who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." Zara turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Do you truly believe that?" Dax hesitated, unsure how to respond. There was something in her tone, something that made his chest tighten. "Look," he said finally, "I get it. You've got bigger things to deal with than babysitting a random human. I'll be fine. I'll figure something out." Zara tilted her head, studying him. "You are surprisingly eager to diminish yourself, Dax." Thanks." It wasn't a compliment. "Oh." She sighed, stepping closer. "You survived the crash. You stood your ground against a sentinel. You've managed to make me laugh more than I thought possible in a single planetary rotation. That is not insignificant." Dax blinked, his heart doing another unwelcome flip. "Wait, you laughed? When?" Zara's lips twitched. "Perhaps you were too busy being terrified to notice." "Wow," Dax said, grinning. "That almost sounded like a compliment. You're really warming up to me, huh?" Zara didn't reply, but the faintest hint of a smile lingered on her face. The moment stretched, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Dax wanted to say something witty, something to break the tension, but his brain betrayed him by going completely blank. "Zara," he said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. "What happens next? Like, after all this?" She hesitated, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "I don't know," she admitted. "My mission has changed. My priorities have shifted." "Because of me?" Dax asked before he could stop himself. Her eyes met his, glowing softly in the dim light. "Perhaps." Dax swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. "That's a lot to process." "For both of us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Dax could respond, the ground beneath them rumbled faintly. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat. "Please tell me that's just the ship settling or something." Zara's expression darkened. "It isn't." The rumble grew louder, the vibrations sending ripples through the air. A sharp, piercing sound followed, like metal being torn apart. Dax clapped his hands over his ears, wincing. "What the hell is that?" he shouted. Zara didn't answer. She was already moving, her posture tense as she scanned the treetops. Her glowing eyes flickered, and she reached for the strange blade-like weapon at her side. "Stay close to the ship," she ordered, her voice firm. "Why?" Dax demanded, scrambling to his feet. "What's going on?" "Hunters," she said grimly. Dax felt the blood drain from his face. "Hunters? As in hunting us?" "As in hunting me," she corrected, her tone clipped. "Oh, great," Dax muttered, panic rising in his chest. "Why are they hunting you? What did you do?" "It's not what I did," Zara said, her grip tightening on her weapon. "It's what I am." Dax's stomach sank. "Okay, cool, so what's the plan? You've got a plan, right?" Zara didn't answer. Instead, she turned toward the noise, her body coiled like a spring. "Zara," Dax said, his voice shaking, "you have a plan, right?" She glanced at him, her expression softer than he expected. "Stay alive. Not exactly comforting." Dax shouted after her as she moved toward the approaching sound. The forest around them erupted in chaos. Strange, sleek shapes darted between the trees, their movements too fast for Dax to track. He pressed himself against the ship, his heart hammering in his chest. One of the figures lunged toward Zara, a blur of black and silver. She moved like lightning, her blade flashing in the dim light. The figure crumpled, but more took its place. Dax watched in a mixture of awe and terror as she fought, her movements impossibly precise. She was like a force of nature, her metallic hair whipping around her as she took down her enemies with ruthless efficiency, but there were too many of them. "Zara!" Dax shouted, his voice cracking. "There's too many! You can't—" "I said stay by the ship," she snapped, her blade slicing through another attacker. Dax clenched his fists, his mind racing. He couldn't just stand there. He had to do something. His eyes landed on a loose panel near the ship's hull, faintly glowing with the same strange energy he'd seen Zara manipulate. Without thinking, he ran to it, his hands fumbling over the alien symbols etched into the surface. Come on," he muttered, pressing random combinations. "Do something cool! Shoot lasers or something!" The panel lit up suddenly, emitting a high-pitched whine. A beam of light shot out, striking one of the attackers and sending it flying. Dax stared at the panel, wide-eyed. "Holy crap, I'm a genius!" "Dax!" Zara's voice snapped him out of his daze. "Right!" he shouted, frantically pressing more symbols. Beams of light shot out in all directions, scattering the attackers and giving Zara a chance to regroup. She retreated toward him, her blade still at the ready. "What are you doing?" "Helping!" he shouted back. Zara glanced at the panel, her eyes widening slightly. "How did you—" "No idea," Dax interrupted. "Just go with it." To his relief, she did. Together, they fought back the remaining attackers, the forest finally falling silent as the last of them fled. Dax collapsed against the ship, his chest heaving. "Okay," he panted. "New plan. We never do that again." Zara looked at him, her expression a mix of exasperation and something else. "You're impossible," she said, shaking her head. "Yeah," Dax said, grinning despite himself. "But you love it." Her silence spoke volumes. The forest was eerily silent now, the thick air humming faintly with residual energy. Dax slumped against the ship, his legs refusing to support him any longer. Every muscle in his body ached, though he wasn't entirely sure if it was from running, panicking, or what he'd mentally dubbed alien laser button mashing. "Are they gone?" he asked between gasps. Zara sheathed her blade with a fluid motion. Her gaze swept the treetops, sharp and calculating. For now, Dax groaned. "That's not comforting." Zara crouched beside him, inspecting a scrape on her arm. Her silvery blood shimmered faintly in the dim light. "They'll regroup. We need to leave this place." "Great," Dax muttered. "Just let me know when I can stop having heart attacks, okay?" She arched an eyebrow. "You did surprisingly well for someone so fragile." "Gee, thanks," he said, glaring at her. "That's exactly what every guy wants to hear." Zara's lips twitched, and Dax was struck by the realization that she might actually be smiling. Not one of her faint, almost imperceptible smirks, but a real, honest-to-space smile. "Seriously, though," he said, his tone softening. "Are you okay? You're bleeding." She glanced at her arm, then back at him. "This is nothing. I've survived worse." "Right. Because you're a badass alien warrior," Dax said, leaning back and closing his eyes. "Meanwhile, I'm just the squishy Earth guy who nearly peed himself." "You're selling yourself short again," Zara said, her voice unusually gentle. Dax cracked an eye open. "Oh yeah? What did I do this time?" "You adapted," she said simply. "Under pressure. Most humans wouldn't have been able to activate the ship's defense system, let alone use it effectively." "I was just pressing random buttons," Dax admitted. "Even so," Zara said, standing and offering him her hand, "you showed courage." Dax hesitated before taking her hand, the warmth of her skin startling against his own. She pulled him to his feet with surprising ease, her grip firm but not harsh. "Thanks," he said, brushing dirt off his pants. "I think." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary, and Dax felt a blush creeping up his neck. "So," he said, desperate to break the silence, "where are we going now? Please tell me it's somewhere with fewer murder lizards and hunters." Zara's expression darkened. "We need to reach higher ground. There's a settlement not far from here. If we're lucky, it will still be intact." "Lucky," Dax repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yeah, because we've been swimming in good luck so far." She ignored him, turning to inspect the ship. Her fingers danced over the controls, and a holographic map flickered to life. Dax squinted at the map, his eyes drawn to a blinking icon in the distance. "Is that the settlement?" "Yes," Zara said, her tone distracted. "If we can reach it, we might find shelter and answers." "Answers to what?" "To why the hunters are here," she said, her jaw tightening. "And who sent them?" Dax frowned, unease curling in his gut. "You think they're working for someone?" "I know they are," Zara said. "Hunters don't operate independently. They were sent here for a reason." Dax rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly wishing he'd stayed on Earth. "Great. So not only are we running for our lives, but there's some big bad out there pulling the strings. This keeps getting better and better." "You're free to leave at any time," Zara said, her tone clipped. Dax froze, his chest tightening. "You don't mean that." She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Do I?" "Come on, Zara," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You can't just drop me in the middle of an alien forest and expect me to survive. I'm not you." Her gaze softened, just a fraction. "No, you're not. Besides," Dax added, forcing a grin, "you'd miss me too much." Zara rolled her eyes, but the corner of her mouth twitched. "You're insufferable." "Yeah, but you like it," he said, his grin widening. She didn't respond, but the faintest hint of a smile lingered as she turned back to the ship. "Come," she said, motioning for him to follow. "We need to move quickly. The hunters will return soon." Dax sighed, falling into step beside her. "You know, I always thought aliens would be all like, 'Take me to your leader,' not 'run for your life before you get vaporized.'" Zara shot him a sideways glance. "Do humans truly think we would travel light years to meet their leaders?" "Well, when you put it like that." Her laughter was soft, barely audible, but it sent a spark of warmth through Dax's chest. For the first time since crash landing on this alien planet, he felt something other than fear. He felt hope. The journey to the settlement was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. The forest seemed alive, shifting and pulsing with bioluminescent hues that danced across their path. Strange sounds echoed around them, whispers of alien wildlife that made Dax jump at every snap of a twig. "Do all alien planets look like this?" Dax asked, glancing at a nearby tree whose leaves glowed faintly with a soft green light. Zara walked ahead of him, her movements fluid and purposeful. "No," she replied without turning. "Many are far less picturesque. You're lucky to have landed here." "Right, lucky," Dax muttered, sidestepping a cluster of mushrooms that hissed when he got too close. "I feel super lucky right now." "Would you prefer a desolate wasteland?" Zara asked, glancing back at him with a raised brow. "I'd prefer my couch, a pizza, and 0 murder lizards," Dax shot back. She chuckled softly, and Dax found himself smiling despite the circumstances. As they continued, The forest began to thin, giving way to rocky terrain. The glowing foliage was replaced by jagged cliffs and shimmering pools of liquid that seemed to defy gravity, hovering inches above the ground. "What is that?" Dax asked, pointing to one of the floating pools. "Gravitate fluid," Zara said. "Don't touch it." "Wasn't planning to," Dax replied, eyeing the liquid warily. Zara stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. Dax nearly bumped into her. "What's wrong?" he whispered. She didn't answer, her glowing eyes scanning the cliffs above. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the alien landscape. And then Dax heard it, a low, guttural growl that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "Tell me that's your stomach," he whispered. Zara didn't respond. She drew her weapon, her posture tense. From the shadows above, a massive creature emerged. Its body was sleek and muscular, its skin a dark, iridescent black that shimmered with flashes of green and purple. 4 glowing eyes locked onto them, and a series of sharp, bone-like protrusions lined its back. Dax's mouth went dry. "That thing looks like it eats T-Rexes for breakfast." "It's a stalker beast," Zara said, her voice calm but firm. "Do not run." "Running sounds like a solid plan right now. If you run, it will chase you," she said, her eyes never leaving the creature. "And it will catch you." Dax swallowed hard, his legs trembling. "Okay, no running. Got it. What's plan B?" "Don't provoke it," Zara said, slowly backing away. The beast growled again, its massive claws digging into the rocky surface as it began to descend toward them. Dax's heart was pounding so loudly he was sure the creature could hear it. "Zara, it looks pretty provoked already." "Stay behind me," she ordered. Before he could protest, the beast lunged. Zara moved like lightning, her blade flashing in the dim light as she intercepted the creature. The clash of metal and claw echoed through the canyon. Dax stumbled backward, his instincts screaming at him to run, but he forced himself to stay put. Zara needed backup. Well, as much backup as a guy with 0 combat training could offer. "Think, Dax, think," he muttered, his eyes darting around the rocky terrain. His gaze landed on a cluster of sharp, crystalline formations jutting out of the ground nearby. An idea sparked in his mind. It was stupid, reckless, probably suicidal. "Perfect," he muttered. While Zara kept the creature occupied, Dax scrambled toward the crystals. He grabbed a large shard, wincing as its sharp edges bit into his hands. "Hey, ugly!" he shouted, waving the shard in the air. The beast's 4 glowing eyes snapped to him. "Yeah, that's right," Dax said, his voice shaking. "Come and get me, you overgrown house cat." "Dax, no!" Zara shouted. But it was too late. The creature roared and charged at him, its massive body tearing across the rocky ground. Dax turned and ran toward the edge of the cliff, his heart pounding like a drum. Just as the beast closed in, he spun around and hurled the shard with all his strength. The crystal struck one of the floating pools of gravitate fluid, causing it to destabilize. The liquid erupted in a burst of energy, sending shards of rock flying and knocking the beast off balance. It let out a deafening roar as it tumbled over the edge of the cliff, disappearing into the void below. Dax collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. Did that actually work?" Zara approached him, her blade still drawn. Her expression was a mix of exasperation and something that almost looked like admiration. "That was reckless," she said. "Yeah," Dax said, grinning weakly. "But it worked." She sheathed her weapon and offered him her hand. "You're either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. I haven't decided which." Dax took her hand, letting her pull him to his feet. "Let's call it a little of both." Zara shook her head, but her lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. As they continued toward the settlement, Dax couldn't help but glance at her, his chest tightening with a strange mix of emotions. "Hey, Zara," he said after a moment. "What? You think you'd have saved me back there if I didn't make you laugh earlier?" She glanced at him, her glowing eyes narrowing slightly. "Don't test me, human. Dax laughed, the sound echoing through the canyon. Noted. As they trekked further into the rocky landscape, the air grew cooler, the temperature dropping rapidly as the sun began to set. The sky, a swirling canvas of violet and orange, painted a stunning backdrop as Dax kept pace beside Zara. The earlier adrenaline from their encounter with the stalker beast had started to wear off, leaving him with a dull ache in his muscles and a mild sense of exhaustion that he couldn't quite shake. Despite the surreal nature of everything that had happened, the crash, the fight, the alien wildlife, he found himself oddly calm when he was near Zara. Maybe it was the adrenaline rush, or maybe it was the fact that despite everything, she was still there. "So, what happens next?" Dax asked, trying to push away the lingering tension. "We find this settlement, get some rest, and then what?" Zara glanced at him, her face shadowed under the growing twilight. "We figure out who's after us." "I'm still trying to wrap my head around that," Dax muttered. "Why would anyone send hunters after you?" Zara didn't immediately respond. She kept walking, her boots scraping softly against the rocky terrain. Dax waited, sensing there was something more to the story, something she wasn't ready to share yet. Finally she spoke, her voice low and measured. "It's not just about me." Dax raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" She turned to him, her face serious. "It's about what I carry, what's on me." Dax blinked. "What do you mean?" Zara hesitated, her gaze flicking to the glowing insignia on her forearm. It pulsed softly in the fading light, like a heartbeat. "That symbol," she said quietly. "It's not just a mark. It's a beacon, one that can be traced." Dax didn't fully understand, but he could sense the weight in her words. He slowed his pace to match hers, thinking over what she'd said. "So they're after you because of a symbol?" "It's not the symbol itself," Zara corrected him, her tone sharp. "It's what it represents. Power, knowledge, something that can change the balance of this galaxy." Dax's mind raced, the pieces starting to come together, though he still didn't have all the answers. "Wait, you're telling me that the galactic equivalent of a treasure map is tattooed on your arm?" Zara gave him a deadpan stare. "That's one way to put it." "So, if we're talking about treasure," Dax said with a slight smirk, "do you happen to know where I can find some gold? I could use a vacation fund." Zara didn't laugh, but her lips quirked upward. "Not exactly the kind of treasure you're imagining." "Yeah, I'm guessing it's more along the lines of an ancient weapon or a planet-destroying artifact?" Dax ventured, raising an eyebrow. Zara's eyes narrowed, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw something flicker in her expression. Something that wasn't just a hardened warrior, but a person caught between duty and fear. "Something like that," she said softly, her voice heavy with the unspoken weight of her responsibility. Before Dax could press further, she held up a hand, signaling for him to stop. The sharpness in her movements was a stark contrast to the moments they'd shared earlier, when she'd been more relaxed, more at ease. "What is it?" Dax asked, his own senses on high alert now. Zara pointed toward a distant ridge, where the silhouette of a structure loomed against the backdrop of the darkening sky. It was just a faint outline, but the shape was unmistakable, a building of some sort, and the flicker of light spilling from its windows confirmed that it was not abandoned. "That's the settlement," Zara said, her voice steady, but filled with an edge Dax hadn't heard before. "We're close." "Finally," Dax muttered, relief rushing through him. His stomach growled, reminding him just how much time had passed since he'd last eaten. As they made their way toward the settlement, Dax couldn't help but wonder just what they would find. Was it just a place of refuge, or were they walking straight into another trap? And if it was the latter, what kind of danger were they really in? Zara's silence was unnerving, and he glanced at her, trying to gauge her thoughts. She seemed distant again, her eyes scanning the horizon with a practiced vigilance. "Do you ever get tired of being in survival mode?" Dax asked, unable to keep the question in. She didn't look at him, but her lips twitched again, just enough for him to catch it. If I got tired, I wouldn't be alive. I'm starting to think you're part machine, Dax said. I've never met anyone so, I don't know, so together under pressure. Zara gave him a sidelong glance. I've had plenty of practice. Yeah, well, you make it look easy, Dax said, falling into step beside her. The settlement grew closer, its lights more distinct now. It looked peaceful from this distance, almost idyllic, but Dax knew better than to assume things were as they appeared. The weight of Zara's earlier words hung in the air. Something was coming, something dangerous. Once we're in there, Zara said, her tone shifting to something more serious. We have to be careful who we trust. I'm guessing that means no making friends with the locals? Dax asked, though the question held a layer of uncertainty. Trust no one, Zara said, her voice steady, though there was an edge to it. Dax nodded, his own sense of caution rising. The weight of their situation had never felt more real. He wasn't just running from hunters anymore. He was running from something far more dangerous, a force that had already set its sights on them. The settlement was just a few hundred meters away now, and Dax found himself holding his breath as they neared the entrance. Would it be a safe haven, or would this place turn out to be their next battlefield? Only time would tell. As they approached the gates, Zara gave him one final look, her expression unreadable. Stay close, she said softly, and don't do anything stupid. Do I ever? Dax asked, flashing a grin. She didn't smile back, but there was something in her eyes. A flicker of something, maybe trust, or maybe something else altogether. I'll let you know after we're out of here alive, she said, her voice quiet, but laced with an undeniable warmth. Dax couldn't help but smile. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't in this alone. As they approached the settlement, Dax couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The gates, which should have been bustling with activity, stood eerily still. The glow of the streetlights cast long shadows, but there were no sounds, no voices, no movement. Zara's expression hardened as she studied the area. Her hand was near the hilt of her weapon, and Dax instinctively mirrored her stance, his pulse quickening. Is this how settlements usually look? Dax asked, trying to sound nonchalant, but failing. Zara didn't answer immediately. She took a few cautious steps forward, her eyes scanning the streets. Then, with a soft exhale, she nodded. Yes, she said. Too quiet. Great. Another one of those really quiet places where something definitely goes wrong. Dax muttered. They continued moving, careful with every step. The high walls surrounding the settlement were cracked, worn down by time, or perhaps by something else entirely. The air smelled faintly of something metallic and stale. Do you think it's a trap? Dax asked, keeping his voice low. Zara hesitated. It could be. Could be. Not exactly the reassuring answer I was hoping for. Zara's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't look back. We don't have a choice. As they reached the settlement's gates, Dax noticed a strange metallic hum vibrating through the air. It was subtle at first, like an engine running too long, but it grew louder the closer they got. Are those generators? Dax asked, his voice tense. Zara nodded. They power the settlement's infrastructure, but they're not supposed to make this kind of noise. Dax's eyes widened as the realization hit him. You think someone's tampered with them? She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she pulled up a small device from her belt, scanning the area with a quick swipe. The screen flashed with a series of complex readings, and Zara's jaw tightened. We're not alone here, she said finally, her voice tight with urgency. Get ready. Dax instinctively took a few steps back. Great, because I've totally got this covered with my zero combat experience. Zara glanced over her shoulder, the faintest flicker of amusement in her eyes. Just stay behind me. Before Dax could respond, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The hum from the generators intensified, and a deep rumbling sound echoed through the streets. He glanced up, his stomach dropping when he saw the faint glimmer of movement above the buildings. "Not good," Dax muttered. From the shadows emerged figures, humanoid but distinctly alien. They were tall, their skin shimmering with iridescence, and their eyes glowed a cold, unnatural blue. They moved swiftly, with a predator's grace, and their weapons, sleek and sharp, hung loosely at their sides. "Well, I'm guessing these aren't the welcoming committee," Dax said under his breath. Zara's hand went to her weapon, and she took a step forward, her posture rigid with focus. "No, they're not." The figures paused, their cold blue eyes locking onto Zara and Dax. There was no hesitation in their movements, only the steady, silent calculation of creatures who had seen too many battles to be intimidated by threats. Zara's voice was low and controlled. "What do you want?" The leader of the group, if the way he carried himself was any indication, stepped forward, his lips curling into something like a grin, though it was more chilling than anything else. His voice, when he spoke, was smooth but cold, like ice scraping across metal. "You're the one they've been looking for," he said, his gaze flicking to Zara. "The one who carries the beacon." Dax's heart thudded painfully in his chest. "Wait, you mean Zara? Why is she—" The leader ignored him, keeping his focus entirely on Zara. "We don't care about the human. It's you we've come for." Zara's fingers tightened on the hilt of her weapon. "I don't have what you're looking for." The leader chuckled, the sound low and threatening. "Oh, you do. It's only a matter of time before you hand it over." Dax's pulse was racing, but he couldn't afford to show fear. Not now. "What's your deal anyway?" he called out, trying to distract the leader from Zara's every movement. "Who sent you?" The leader's smile widened, but it was all teeth. "The ones who understand power. The ones who understand that everything has a price." Zara's expression didn't change, but Dax could see the tension in her jaw. "You'll never get it," she said firmly. "Not from me." The leader's eyes gleamed with something darker, something predatory. "We'll see about that." Before Dax could react, the alien raised his hand, and the others moved in a synchronized wave, their weapons drawn. Zara sprang into action, drawing her blade with a fluid motion that seemed almost too fast for Dax to follow. The crack of energy weapons filled the air as the fight erupted. Dax barely dodged the first blast, his heart nearly leaping out of his chest. "This is happening way too fast!" he shouted, his voice tinged with panic. Zara's voice was like a calm, steady anchor in the chaos. "Stay down, Dax!" He tried to move back, but his legs felt like jelly, the adrenaline of the moment overwhelming. He watched helplessly as Zara engaged with the leader, her blade flashing in the dim light, sparks flying as it clashed with his weapon. It was the first time Dax had seen her truly in battle. There was no hesitation in her movements, no fear. She was an extension of the fight, her every motion a precise strike aimed to disable and disarm. But even so, the odds were stacked against them. One of the aliens advanced on Dax, and he instinctively raised his arms, a terrified reflex. He was about to get vaporized when, to his surprise, the alien stopped, its head tilting slightly as if it were studying him. "What are you doing?" Dax blurted out, trying to keep his voice steady. The alien let out a low hum, its glowing eyes scanning Dax. "You're interesting," it said, its voice almost curious. Dax blinked. I'm just an ordinary human guy. You know, Earth, pizza, sports, and awkward social interactions." The alien cocked its head, as if trying to understand. Dax took the momentary distraction as his chance to get away. He dove behind a nearby crate, heart hammering in his chest. Zara's voice echoed in his ear. "Get to the ship, now!" He looked up, spotting her across the street, locked in a fierce battle with the leader. She was strong, capable, but even she couldn't hold off an entire squad forever. Dax glanced back at the aliens closing in on him. No more thinking. No more hesitating. It was time to run. Dax didn't waste another second. His legs moved instinctively, propelling him toward the nearest alleyway, his heart pounding with every footfall. His hands were slick with sweat, but his mind was clear enough to know he needed to get to the ship and get out of there, fast. Behind him, the sounds of battle raged on. The crack of blasters, the clang of metal, the distorted hum of energy weapons clashing in the air. It all blurred together into a symphony of chaos that only pushed him forward. His eyes darted over his shoulder, catching glimpses of Zara's fierce movements. She was holding her own against the leader, but there was a desperation to her strikes now. Her blade whirled in the dim light, deflecting blows, but he saw the way her foot slipped on the rocky ground, the fatigue setting in. That's when he heard it, a voice low and menacing cutting through the noise. "You can run, human, but you can't hide." Dax froze, his breath catching in his throat. The voice had come from one of the aliens. He wasn't sure which one, but it didn't matter. He had to move. As he sprinted down the narrow alley, the cool night air hit his face, the smell of old metal and dust overwhelming his senses. He didn't dare stop to look back again. He could hear their footsteps, fast, relentless, growing closer. He reached the end of the alley and skidded to a halt. The ship was just ahead, tucked behind a cluster of rusted buildings. The soft blue glow of its docking bay lights offered a small sense of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the sound of heavy boots approaching from behind. He pushed himself harder, running at full speed now. His hand reached for the ship's entry panel, fingers trembling as he swiped his palm over the interface. The hatch creaked open with a hiss, and Dax dove inside, slamming the door behind him with a force that left his shoulder aching. He staggered to his feet, gasping for air. He could hear the muffled thud of footsteps outside, but for now at least, he was safe. His hands flew over the controls, flipping switches, powering up systems. But something in the back of his mind nagged at him. Where was Zara? His eyes darted to the viewport, scanning the darkened streets of the settlement. He could see no sign of her. The battle still raged, but there was no way to know who was winning, or if she was even still alive. His chest tightened. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He couldn't just leave her behind, not after everything, but he wasn't sure if he could make it back out there in time. The alien hunters were closing in, and he was alone in a ship that hadn't been fully prepared for takeoff. The engines were still powering up, the hum low and steady, but there was no way they'd be ready for full thrust before those aliens reached him. His fingers hovered over the console, his mind racing. He thought about the battle, Zara's skill, her focus, but the fear gnawed at him. What if she didn't make it out? What if she was already? The hatch opened. Dax's heart skipped a beat as he whipped around to find Zara standing in the doorway, her clothes torn, her breathing labored, but very much alive. "Zara!" he shouted, rushing toward her. She gave him a quick, terse nod. "I told you to stay inside." Dax blinked, still processing the relief that flooded his veins. What the hell?" "I thought..." She raised a hand to silence him. "We don't have time for questions." Dax moved aside, gesturing for her to get in. "Get in. I'm not leaving without you." She shot him an amused look, her lips twitching into a half-smile. "I can handle myself." "Clearly," Dax said, still reeling from the sight of her. "But just this once, let me help." Zara stepped inside, her boots clicking softly on the metal floor. The door slid shut behind her, and Dax rushed to the controls, his hands moving with a practiced speed as he engaged the thrusters. The ship shuddered beneath him as it started to lift off, the low hum of the engines growing louder. He could hear the distant sounds of the alien hunters shouting, but it was too late now. They were in the air, heading toward the stars. As the ship ascended, Dax felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The tension from the settlement, the fear from earlier, all of it started to dissipate as the weightlessness of space took over. They were out of danger, for now. He glanced over at Zara, who was watching the viewport. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the surroundings. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now. She didn't look at him, but her voice was steady. "I will be." Dax let the silence stretch between them for a moment, his thoughts swirling. There were still too many questions, too many things he didn't understand. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel entirely alone. "So what's the plan now?" Dax asked, finally breaking the silence. "Do we go back to that settlement and fight them off again?" Zara's eyes flicked toward him, her expression unreadable. "No. We keep moving. We'll figure out our next move once we're out of range." "Out of range of what?" Dax asked, confused. "The hunters," she said. "They're not the only ones after me." Dax's brow furrowed. "Wait, you mean there's more?" Zara didn't answer immediately. She looked out the viewport again, her face hardening. "There's always more." Dax swallowed the lump in his throat. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. He had no idea what kind of trouble he was really in, but one thing was clear. He was in it now, and there was no turning back. He looked at her again, the realization sinking in that this was no ordinary adventure. This was something bigger, much bigger, and he was along for the ride, whether he liked it or not. "So, what now?" he asked, a little louder this time. Zara finally turned her gaze toward him. "Now, we survive, and we fight back." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 1,000 battles, 1,000 lost causes, and something else, something more personal, that Dax wasn't sure he was ready to confront. But for now, that was enough. They were flying through space, together. And that, at least, felt like something worth fighting for. Dax sat in the co-pilot seat, staring out at the endless expanse of space, his mind racing. They'd left the settlement far behind, the twinkling stars now the only company they had. The ship hummed steadily beneath him, the calm after the storm. But the quiet was just an illusion. There was still so much he didn't understand, about Zara, about the hunters, and most of all, about the beacon. Zara sat across from him, her focus intense as she manipulated a holographic map. Her fingers danced over the glowing interface, tracing paths through unknown sectors of space. Dax watched her, fascinated by her calm demeanor, the way she carried herself with purpose, even after everything they'd been through. She was a force, strong, sharp, and completely untouchable. And yet, in the quiet moments like this, there was something else in her eyes. Something he hadn't noticed before. "Where are we headed now?" Dax finally asked, breaking the silence. Zara didn't look up immediately, but after a long pause, she spoke, her voice low. "Far away from here. Somewhere safe. For now." Dax raised an eyebrow. "Safe? You mean there's a place where the hunters won't find you?" She turned her gaze to him, her lips curving into a faint smile. "It's not about them not finding me. It's about making sure they wish they hadn't." Dax chuckled despite himself. "You're a lot scarier than you look, you know that?" Zara's smile grew wider, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "That's the idea." They shared a brief, light-hearted moment, but Dax's mind was still racing. He leaned forward, the question that had been burning in him finally slipping out. "What's the deal with the beacon, Zara? Why is everyone after it? And why are they after you?" Her expression hardened, just a fraction, but it was enough for Dax to see that he'd touched on something deeper, something she hadn't been ready to share. She took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the holographic interface, but she didn't answer him right away. I've been running from this for a long time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The beacon is something the universe isn't ready for. It's not a weapon, not really. It's a signal, a call for something far bigger than anyone could ever understand." Dax furrowed his brow. "What do you mean, bigger?" Zara's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, there was a flicker of vulnerability in her gaze. "Something older, something dangerous." Dax's stomach dropped. And that's what they're after? Whoever these hunters are? She nodded, her expression grim. Yes, they think they can control it, but they don't understand the power they're messing with. Dax swallowed hard. And you? What? You're the one who's supposed to stop them? Zara's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm trying to survive long enough to figure that out. The air between them was thick with tension, the weight of their shared silence heavy in the small confines of the ship. Dax wanted to say something comforting, but what could he say? How could he even begin to understand the kind of responsibility Zara was carrying? But before he could say another word, the ship's alert system beeped, sharp and shrill. Zara's eyes snapped to the screen, her fingers flying across the interface as she read the incoming data. They've found us, she said, her voice cold as ice. Dax's pulse quickened. He'd known this moment was coming. But knowing and being ready were two entirely different things. What do we do now? He asked, his hands instinctively gripping the armrests. Zara's gaze flicked toward him, her eyes narrowing in calculation. We fight! Again? Dax exclaimed, incredulous. How many times are we going to have to— I'm not running this time, she interrupted, cutting him off. We don't have to run. We can win this. Dax's heart raced as the ship's controls flickered, the systems coming alive. He knew Zara had a plan. She always did. But this felt different. There was no more escaping, no more hiding. This was the end game. Are you ready for this? Zara asked, her voice soft but steely. Dax turned to her, meeting her gaze with a newfound determination. I'm not going anywhere. Zara gave a small nod, as if approving of his answer. Then let's make it count. With that, she flipped a switch and the ship lurched forward, engines roaring to life. Dax's stomach dropped as they shot into hyperspace, the stars stretching into long, glowing streaks. It wasn't long before they encountered the enemy, an entire fleet, waiting in the darkness, their ships ominous against the backdrop of distant stars. Dax took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. The hunters were here, and they had one last shot at stopping them. The stakes couldn't have been higher. It was do or die. Zara's fingers danced over the controls, and the ship responded with an almost eerie precision. The enemy fired first, their energy blasts cutting through space like lightning. But Zara was faster. She dodged with a deftness that left Dax in awe, the ship's shields flickering with each near miss. She didn't hesitate. She didn't falter. She was the embodiment of everything Dax had come to respect about her. Brave, unyielding, unstoppable. Dax helped where he could, working the weapon systems, firing back at their enemies with a fierce determination. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for her. And somehow, against all odds, they made it. The last enemy ship exploded in a brilliant burst of light, and the remaining fleet scattered, retreating into the void. Zara didn't take a breath until the final ship was out of sight, her fingers still hovering over the controls, just in case. Dax exhaled sharply, his body sagging with relief. We did it. Zara let out a long breath of her own, but her face remained unreadable. It's not over, not yet. Dax nodded. But we're one step closer. She glanced at him, her expression softening just a fraction. Yeah, we are. The ship sailed through the stars, the universe stretching out before them. They had fought, they had survived, and somehow, they had won. Together. Zara looked out at the infinite horizon, her mind already on the next step. But Dax didn't care. For once, the future didn't seem so uncertain. Maybe they didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in a long time, Dax felt something he hadn't expected, a sense of peace. And that was enough for now. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you want to hear more epic adventures like this one, make sure to hit that notification bell.